In the dusty territory of New Mexico, 1882, most folks believed a woman past 35 had missed her chance at happiness. Eleanor Hart had heard those whispers for years too old, too plain, too set in her ways for any decent man to want. When James Cutter, a weathered widower with calloused hands and 2 young children, sent for a mail-order bride, the matchmaker warned him about Ellie. "She's been passed over dozens of times," the woman said. "No one wants damaged goods." But James had buried one wife already and knew something about being overlooked himself. When Ellie stepped off that dusty stagecoach, chin held high despite the stares, he made a decision that shocked the entire town. Without hesitation, James married her that very day, declaring her his wife before God and everyone. What happened next would transform 2 broken hearts and change an entire town's understanding of what it means to be worthy of love. But could this unlikely marriage survive the whispers and judgment? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cutter ranch as James stood at his kitchen window, watching the dust settle from yesterday's whirlwind ceremony. The simple gold band on his finger felt foreign, heavier than the worn leather gloves he pulled on each dawn. 3 years had passed since Mary's death. 3 years of silence broken only by the sound of his children's laughter echoing through rooms that had grown too quiet, too empty. On the mantel above the cold fireplace, Mary's portrait gazed down with gentle eyes, her face forever young, forever smiling. James had been 25 when they'd married, Mary just 22, both of them believing they had all the time in the world. Now, at 42, he understood how quickly time could slip through a man's fingers like sand. "Papa," Sarah's voice drifted from the doorway, hesitant and small. At 12, she carried herself with the careful dignity of a girl who'd learned too young that mothers could disappear like morning mist. Her dark hair hung in 2 neat braids down her back, and her brown eyes so like Mary shelled, a wariness that broke James's heart every time he looked at her. "Morning, sweetheart." James turned from the window, forcing a smile that felt rusty from disuse. "Sleep well?" Sarah shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes. She hadn't slept well in 3 years, not since the fever took her mother. Neither had 8-year-old Tommy, who emerged from behind his sister's skirts like a shadow, his sandy hair sticking up in all directions, and his father's blue eyes wide with uncertainty. "Where is she?" Tommy whispered, as if speaking too loudly might summon this stranger who'd suddenly become their stepmother. "Mrs. Cutter is in the guest room," James said carefully, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "She's adjusting." That was putting it kindly. Eleanor Hartnell, Eleanor Cutter had spent their wedding night in the small room off the kitchen, the one Mary had used for sewing. James had offered her the master bedroom, but she'd declined with a dignity that had impressed him, even as it left him feeling awkward and uncertain. This arrangement, after all, had been about practicality, not romance. At least, that's what he'd told himself. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew their attention. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, her graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a practical wool dress, the color of autumn leaves, and her hands, James noticed, were steady as she smoothed her skirts. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of someone who'd been educated back east. Her eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the stack of unwashed dishes, the cold stove, the children clinging to their father's legs. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," James replied, though the formality of the moment felt as stiff as his Sunday collar. "Children, say good morning to Mrs. Cutter." Sarah offered a barely audible greeting, while Tommy buried his face against his father's pants. Eleanor's expression softened, and she knelt to Tommy's level, careful not to crowd him. "I understand. This is all very strange," she said gently. "It's strange for me too, but perhaps we can figure it out together." Tommy peeked up at her, his curiosity warring with his shyness. Eleanor smiled a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her plain features into something warmer, more approachable. "I don't suppose you'd like to help me make breakfast?" she asked. "I'm not familiar with your stove yet, and I'd hate to burn the house down on my first day." Despite himself, Tommy giggled, The sound was so unexpected, so welcome, that James felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Over the next hour, Eleanor moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, her presence both foreign and oddly comforting. She cooked eggs and bacon, brewed coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter brew James had been choking down for years, and somehow managed to coax both children into helping without making them feel imposed upon. "Tell me about your ranch," Eleanor said as they sat down to eat, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "How long have you been here?" 15 years, James replied, surprised by the question. Most women would have asked about the house, the nearest neighbors, the social prospects. "Bought it when Mary and I first married. Started with 50 head of cattle and a dream that probably seemed bigger than it was practical." Eleanor nodded, her attention focused entirely on his words. "And now? 300 head, good grazing land, a decent water source." James found himself talking more than he had in months, drawn out by her genuine interest. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's ours, was ours, is ours," he corrected awkwardly. "It sounds like you've built something to be proud of," Eleanor said, and there was no condescension in her voice, no hint that she found his modest success lacking. "I'd like to see it when you have time." James looked at her more closely. Most women of his acquaintance would have blanched at the idea of touring cattle pastures and checking fence lines. Eleanor looked genuinely interested, as if she understood that the land was more than just dirt and grass. It was home, legacy, the foundation upon which everything else rested. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. James glanced out the window and suppressed a groan. Ben Walsh, his nearest neighbor, was riding up to the house with the eager expression of a man bearing gossip. Behind him rode Dr. Fletcher and Reverend Morrison, their faces wearing the carefully neutral expressions of men on a mission. "Looks like we're about to have company," James said, rising from the table. Eleanor's back straightened, and James saw her hands briefly clench in her lap before she composed herself. "I see. Well, I suppose it was inevitable." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts again. "I'm Mrs. Cutter now, for better or worse. I won't hide in the kitchen like some shameful secret." James felt a surge of admiration for her quiet courage. "Sarah, Tommy, why don't you go play in your room for a while?" The children needed no further encouragement. As they scampered away, Eleanor moved to stand beside James, not quite touching but close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "Whatever they say," she said quietly, "remember that we both made this choice. We don't owe anyone explanations." James looked down at her, this woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach and into his life, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope. "No," he agreed, "we don't." The knock came at the door, sharp and insistent. James opened it to find his 3 visitors crowded on the porch, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned to disapproving. "James," Ben Walsh said, his eyes sliding past James to where Eleanor stood. "Heard you got married yesterday. Thought we'd come by and meet the new Mrs. Cutter." "That's thoughtful of you," James replied, though he could hear the edge in his own voice. "Eleanor, these are my neighbors, Ben Walsh, Dr. Fletcher, and Reverend Morrison." Eleanor stepped forward with the same dignity she'd shown yesterday, her chin raised and her eyes steady. "Gentlemen, I'm pleased to meet you." The 3 men exchanged glances. Dr. Fletcher, a thin man with kind eyes, was the first to speak. "Welcome to Sage Creek, Mrs. Cutter. I hope you'll find our community welcoming." "I'm sure I will," Eleanor replied smoothly. "James has told me so much about his friends and neighbors." Ben Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's just that. Well, we were all a bit surprised. James here's been on his own for 3 years, and then suddenly I decided it was time to move forward with my life," James said firmly. "Eleanor is my wife, and I'd appreciate it if she was treated with the respect due to any member of this community." Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. Of course. It's just that some folks in town are." Well, they're talking. People always talk, Eleanor said calmly, usually about things that are none of their business. The Reverend's eyebrows rose at her directness, but James saw a flicker of approval in Dr. Fletcher's eyes. Ben Walsh, however, was not so easily deterred. It's just that Martha Hendricks was saying how strange it was, you marrying a woman you'd never met, and her being, well. Being what? James's voice dropped to a dangerous level. Ben flushed. Being older than most brides, I suppose. I'm 38, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. Hardly ancient, though I understand that might seem advanced to some people. I assure you, gentlemen, I'm quite capable of fulfilling my duties as a wife and stepmother. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Dr. Fletcher stepped forward with a genuine smile. I'm sure you are, Mrs. Cutter, and if you need anything at all medical attention, advice about settling in, please, don't hesitate to call on me. Thank you, Doctor. That's very kind. After the men left, Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her composure finally cracking slightly. Well, she said with a shaky laugh, that was enlightening. I'm sorry, James said. They mean well, but they think you've made a mistake. Eleanor's voice was steady, but James caught the hurt underneath. They think you could have done better. Could I? James asked, surprising himself with the question. Could I have done better than a woman who handles gossip with grace, who makes my children smile, who asks about my cattle instead of my bank account? Eleanor looked at him with something like wonder. You really mean that? I really do. And as he said it, James realized it was true. Perhaps this arrangement would be more than just practical after all. Perhaps, given time, it might even be something approaching happiness. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows as Eleanor helped Sarah with her letters while Tommy played with his wooden horse at their feet. James watched from the doorway, struck by how natural the scene looked, how right it felt to have life and warmth filling these rooms again. Outside, the ranch stretched toward the horizon, 300 head of cattle grazing peacefully under the wide New Mexico sky. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, James Cutter's house felt like a home. 3 weeks into their marriage, the notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Billy Morrison, with the kind of breathless excitement that only bad news seemed to inspire in 12-year-old boys. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when James found her, the crumpled paper clenched in his fist. She took one look at his face and knew their fragile peace was about to be shattered. What is it? She asked, setting down the basket of wet clothes. James handed her the notice without a word. Eleanor smoothed it out, her eyes scanning the formal language that barely concealed its true purpose. A town meeting, called by the concerned citizens of Sage Creek to discuss moral standards and community values. The date was set for Saturday evening, the location, the schoolhouse. They're not even trying to be subtle, Eleanor said quietly, folding the paper with steady hands. Eleanor, you don't have to. Don't have to what? Attend? She looked up at him, her grey eyes flashing. James, I may be new to this territory, but I'm not new to small towns. If I don't go, they'll say I'm ashamed. If I do go, they'll tear me apart in front of everyone. Either way, they win. James felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders, the same feeling he'd carried during Mary's illness, when all his strength and determination couldn't fight an enemy he couldn't see or touch. There has to be another way. There is. Eleanor's voice was calm, but James could see the steel beneath. We go together. We face whatever they have to say, and we don't apologize for making a choice that hurts no one, but apparently offends their delicate sensibilities. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the lizards seek shade. The schoolhouse was packed, every bench filled with the upstanding citizens of Sage Creek. James and Eleanor walked in together, her hand resting lightly on his arm, both of them dressed in their Sunday best, as if they were attending a social rather than what amounted to a trial. The talking stopped the moment they appeared. James felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispers that followed in their wake. Beside him, Eleanor's steps never faltered, though he could feel the tension in her arm where it touched his. They found seats in the back, Sarah and Tommy having been left with Mrs. Fletcher despite the children's protests. James was grateful for that small mercy. Whatever was about to happen, his children didn't need to witness it. Martha Hendricks stood at the front of the room, her ample form draped in black silk and righteous indignation. She called the meeting to order with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself the moral guardian of the community. "We're here tonight," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "to discuss a matter that affects us all. The moral standards of our community, the example we set for our children, the kind of behavior we're willing to tolerate." James felt Eleanor stiffen beside him, but her expression remained serene, almost bored. It was a masterful performance, one that clearly frustrated Mrs. Hendricks. "We all knew and respected Mary Cutter," the woman continued, her small eyes fixed on James. "A godly woman, a devoted wife and mother, taken from us too soon. We understood James's grief, his struggle to raise his children alone. We were prepared to help, to support him through his time of trial." The implicit accusation hung in the air like smoke. James had rejected their help, their perfectly reasonable suggestions about suitable local women who might make appropriate wives. Instead, he'd chosen this stranger, this aging spinster, who'd been passed over by every decent man who'd met her. But instead of turning to his community, to the women we all know and trust, James Cutter sent away for. Well, I think we all know what kind of woman answers those advertisements. Eleanor's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on James's arm, the only sign that the words had found their mark. Around the room, heads nodded in solemn agreement. James felt his temper beginning to fray. "Furthermore," Mrs. Hendricks continued, warming to her theme, "this hasty marriage, this unseemly rush to the altar without proper courtship or community involvement, sets a dangerous precedent. What are we teaching our children? That marriage is merely a business transaction, that a woman's worth can be measured in a letter, purchased like cattle or household goods?" Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. James recognized Ben Walsh's voice, along with several others he'd considered friends. "I'd like to know," called out Samuel Tucker from the middle of the room, "what qualifications this woman possesses to be a mother to those children. What do we really know about her background, her character, her suitability for such an important role?" The questions came faster now, each one more pointed than the last. Where was she from? Why had she never married? What kind of woman reached her age without finding a husband? What was she hiding? Eleanor sat through it all in perfect silence, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. James watched her profile, admiring her composure, even as he felt his own control slipping. These people, his neighbors, his supposed friends, were tearing apart his wife's character and reputation, as if she weren't sitting right there, as if she was some abstract problem to be solved, rather than a flesh-and-blood woman who deserved their respect. "Perhaps," said Dr. Fletcher from the front row, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of conversation, "we should allow Mrs. Cutter to speak for herself." The suggestion was met with a moment of startled silence. Clearly, no one had expected the subject of their discussion to actually participate in it. Eleanor rose slowly, and James had the strange sensation of watching a queen stand before her subjects. There was something regal in her bearing, something that commanded attention despite her plain dress and graying hair. "Thank you, Dr. Fletcher," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address the concerns that have been raised tonight." She paused, her gaze moving slowly around the room, meeting the eyes of her accusers one by one. "You want to know about my qualifications to be a wife and mother? Very well. I am 38 years old, educated, experienced in running a household, and capable of hard work. I can read, write, and cipher. I can cook, clean, sew, and tend to the sick. I have helped deliver babies, nursed the dying, and taught children their letters." Her voice remained level, matter-of-fact, as if she were reciting a recipe rather than defending her worth as a human being. "You want to know why I never married? The truth is, I was engaged twice. The first time, the gentleman decided I was too independent, too opinionated for his taste. The second time, my fiancé discovered I would not inherit my father's business, that honor was reserved for my brother, and decided his affections lay elsewhere. James felt a surge of anger on her behalf. What kind of men were they, to throw away a woman of Eleanor's obvious qualities over such petty considerations? You want to know what kind of woman answers a mail-order advertisement? I can tell you, the kind who believes in second chances. The kind who thinks love might be found in unexpected places, with unexpected people. The kind who is willing to take a risk on hope rather than resign herself to loneliness. Mrs. Hendricks's mouth had compressed into a thin line of disapproval. That's all very pretty, but it doesn't address the real issue here. The example being set, the example? Eleanor's voice sharpened slightly. You mean the example of a man choosing to move forward with his life? Of two adults making a decision that affects no one but themselves and their family? Or perhaps you mean the example of a community so concerned with appearances that they would publicly humiliate a widow and orphans? The room erupted in angry murmurs. Someone shouted that she had no right to lecture them about community standards when she'd been among them for less than a month. Another voice declared that this was exactly what they'd expected from someone of her background. Eleanor weathered the storm with the same calm dignity she'd shown throughout the evening. But James had heard enough. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, and the room fell silent. I married Eleanor because I wanted to, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Not because I needed a housekeeper or a caretaker for my children, though she excels at both. Not because I was desperate or lonely, though I was both. I married her because in 3 weeks she's shown me more kindness, understanding, and genuine companionship than I've experienced in 3 years. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people he'd known for over a decade, people he'd considered friends and neighbors. You talk about moral standards and community values. Where were those values when my children were struggling with grief and I was barely holding this family together? Where was this concern for our welfare then? Ben Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Hendricks opened her mouth to speak, but James wasn't finished. Eleanor came here asking for nothing more than a chance at happiness. She's earned her place in my home and in this community through her actions, not her bloodline or her connections. If that offends your sensibilities, that's your problem, not ours. He extended his hand to Eleanor, who took it without hesitation. We're leaving now. When you're ready to treat my wife with the respect she deserves, you know where to find us. They walked out together, heads high, leaving behind a roomful of stunned faces and uncomfortable silence. But James knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Outside, the night air was cool and sweet after the stifling atmosphere of the schoolhouse. Eleanor didn't speak until they'd walked nearly half the distance home, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For standing up for me, for choosing me over them. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes bright in the moonlight. I know it cost you. They were your friends, your community. You've been here 15 years, and You're my wife, James said simply. That means something to me, even if it doesn't mean anything to them. Eleanor nodded, but James could see the doubt lingering in her expression. The seeds of uncertainty had been planted tonight, and he knew they would take root and grow if left untended. The question was whether their fragile new marriage was strong enough to weather the storm that was surely coming. The morning after the town meeting dawned grey and sullen, matching the mood that had settled over the Cutter household like dust after a windstorm. Eleanor rose before dawn, as had become her habit, and found herself standing in the kitchen with her mother's old recipe book clutched in her hands. The leather binding was worn smooth from years of use, the pages yellowed and spotted with ingredients from 1,000 meals prepared with love. She'd carried it with her from Boston to Denver, from Denver to Santa Fe, and finally to this remote ranch in New Mexico territory. It was one of the few things that truly belonged to her, a tangible connection to the woman who'd taught her that food was more than sustenance, was comfort, memory, love made manifest in flour and eggs and careful attention. This morning she needed that comfort desperately. James found her there an hour later, surrounded by the makings of what appeared to be enough breakfast to feed a small army. Biscuits were rising in the warming oven, bacon sizzled in the skillet, and the coffee pot bubbled cheerfully on the stove. The familiar sounds and smells of home filled the kitchen, pushing back against the lingering echoes of last night's humiliation. "Expecting company?" he asked, attempting lightness but falling short. Eleanor managed a smile. "Just trying to keep my hands busy. When I'm upset, I cook. When I'm really upset, I cook enough to feed half the territory." James studied her face, noting the fine lines of tension around her eyes, the careful way she held herself, as if afraid she might shatter if she moved too quickly. "Eleanor, the children will be down soon," she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "They don't need to see us dwelling on last night. Today is a new day, and we have work to do." As if summoned by her words, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her dark hair braided neatly and her expression wary. Behind her, Tommy clutched his favorite wooden horse, the one his father had carved for him the Christmas after his mother died. "Morning, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice brightening with genuine warmth. "I hope you're hungry. I may have gotten a bit carried away with breakfast." Sarah's eyes swept the laden table, taking in the abundance with the careful attention of a child who'd learned that good things were fragile and temporary. "Did something happen?" Eleanor and James exchanged a glance. They'd agreed not to burden the children with the details of last night's confrontation, but Sarah was too observant to be easily fooled. "Just a town meeting," James said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about things that don't really matter much in the long run." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained troubled. At 12, she'd already learned that adult disagreements often had far-reaching consequences for children. Tommy, however, was more easily distracted by the promise of food and the warm atmosphere Eleanor had created. "Can I help?" he asked, edging closer to where Eleanor was flipping bacon with practiced ease. "Of course you can. How are you at setting the table?" As Tommy bustled around the kitchen, carefully placing plates and utensils under Eleanor's patient guidance, James found himself watching his new wife with growing admiration. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruel words and public humiliation, she was determined to maintain normalcy for his children. She was putting their needs before her own wounded feelings, and the realization stirred something deep in his chest. Over breakfast, Eleanor listened to Tommy's chatter about the new calf that had been born the previous week, asked Sarah thoughtful questions about her schoolwork, and somehow managed to draw both children into easy conversation. James marveled at her skill. It was clear she'd had experience with children, despite never having any of her own. "Mrs. Cutter," Sarah said suddenly, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Some of the children at school, they've been saying things." Eleanor's hands stilled, but her voice remained calm. "What kind of things?" "About you, about why Papa married you." Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Jenny Morrison said her mother thinks you must have. That you must have tricked Papa somehow." James felt his anger rising again, but Eleanor's gentle touch on his arm kept him silent. "What do you think, Sarah?" Eleanor asked. "Do you think I tricked your father?" Sarah considered this seriously, her young face grave with the weight of adult concerns. "No," she said finally. I think you make him smile more, and you fixed my doll when I thought it was broken forever." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Your doll?" Sarah nodded and disappeared from the kitchen, returning moments later with a porcelain doll that had clearly seen better days. One arm had been broken and carefully mended, the crack barely visible under skillful repair work. The dress had been patched and cleaned, and new ribbons adorned the faded hair. "I found it in my sewing basket yesterday," Sarah said, cradling the doll against her chest. "Mama gave it to me before she got sick. It broke when I dropped it last year, and Papa tried to fix it, but sometimes a job needs a woman's touch," Eleanor finished gently. She'd spent hours the previous evening working on the delicate repair, guided by memories of her own childhood dolls and the patient lessons her mother had taught her about mending precious things. "It's perfect now," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's like she was never broken at all." James felt his throat tighten. He'd tried so hard to fix that doll, had spent hours with glue and determination, but his large hands and limited experience with such delicate work had left the toy more damaged than before. Watching his daughter's face light up as she held her restored treasure, he understood that Eleanor had given her something far more valuable than a repaired doll. She'd given her hope that broken things could be made whole again. After breakfast, Eleanor surprised him by asking to see the ranch. Not the house or the immediate grounds, but the working heart of the operation, the cattle, the pastures, the daily business that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. "Most women wouldn't be interested in the less glamorous aspects of ranch life," James said as they walked toward the main pasture, Tommy skipping ahead of them while Sarah followed at a more dignified distance. "Most women haven't spent the last 10 years keeping their family's accounts while their brother learned the business," Eleanor replied. "My father owned a shipping company in Boston. I may not know cattle, but I understand what it takes to make an enterprise profitable." James looked at her with surprise. "You never mentioned that." "You never asked." Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, without accusation. "People assume many things about unmarried women of a certain age. That we've lived sheltered lives, that we lack practical experience, that we're helpless creatures in need of rescue. The truth is often quite different." They stopped at the fence that separated the home pasture from the range, where several dozen cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. James pointed out the different breeds, explained his breeding program, described the challenges of raising livestock in the sometimes harsh New Mexico climate. Eleanor listened intently, asking intelligent questions that revealed a quick mind and genuine interest. When he mentioned the ongoing problem of predators, wolves and coyotes that picked off stragglers, she suggested moving the most vulnerable animals to pastures closer to the house. "The extra work of moving them back and forth might be worth it if it reduces your losses," she said thoughtfully. "And if you're losing cattle, you're losing money you can't afford to lose." "That's actually not a bad idea," James admitted. "I hadn't thought of it that way." "Fresh eyes sometimes see solutions that familiarity misses," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "It's one of the few advantages of being an outsider." The word hung between them, a reminder of last night's confrontation and the battle lines that had been drawn. Eleanor was an outsider here, and some people seemed determined to keep her that way. "Eleanor," James said carefully, "about last night." "James, please." She turned to face him, her grey eyes serious. "I know what I'm facing here. I'm not naive enough to think one evening of unpleasantness will be the end of it. People like Martha Hendricks don't give up easily, especially when they believe they're fighting for the moral soul of their community. But you're not giving up either." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "No, I'm not giving up. I've spent too many years accepting other people's judgments about my worth, letting them decide what I deserved or didn't deserve. I won't do that anymore." James felt something shift inside him, a recognition of the steel beneath her gentle exterior. This woman had been tested before and had emerged stronger for it. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah fell into step beside Eleanor while Tommy raced ahead to examine an interesting rock he'd discovered. "Mrs. Cutter," Sarah said hesitantly, Will you stay, even if people say mean things?" Eleanor stopped walking and knelt down to Sarah's level, taking the girl's hands in her own. "Sarah, I made a promise to your father when I married him. I promised to be part of this family, to help take care of you and Tommy, to make a home here. I don't break my promises, especially not because of gossip or unkind words. But what if they keep being mean to you? Then they'll be disappointed when I don't run away crying," Eleanor said with a gentle smile. "I've survived worse things than the disapproval of people who don't know me well enough to judge me fairly. Have you?" Sarah considered this question with the seriousness of someone much older than her 12 years. "I survived Mama dying," she said finally. Yes, you did. You survived something terrible and kept going, kept taking care of your brother and helping your father. That makes you much stronger than most people realize. Eleanor brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face. We strong women have to stick together, don't we? For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, Sarah smiled, a real smile that transformed her solemn face and reminded James so powerfully of Mary that his breath caught in his throat. That evening, as they sat down to another of Eleanor's excellent dinners, James found himself thinking about the changes that had already taken place in their household. The children seemed more relaxed, more willing to talk and laugh. The house itself felt different, warmer, more alive, as if Eleanor's presence had awakened something that had been sleeping for too long. When Eleanor reached across the table to wipe a spot of gravy from Tommy's chin, the gesture was so natural, so maternal, that James felt his chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't quite ready to name. This woman who'd been a stranger just weeks ago was already becoming essential to the rhythm of their daily lives. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed and the dishes washed and put away, James and Eleanor found themselves alone in the kitchen. She was mending one of Tommy's shirts by lamplight, her needle moving with the same steady precision she brought to everything else. "Eleanor," James said quietly, "I want you to know what you're doing for the children, for all of us. It means more than I can say." She looked up from her sewing, and in the golden light of the lamp, James caught a glimpse of what she might have looked like as a young woman before. Disappointment and rejection had taught her to guard her heart so carefully. "They're good children, James. It's not hard to love them." "And their father?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, surprising them both. Eleanor's needle stilled, and for a moment the only sound in the kitchen was the soft ticking of the mantel clock. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Ask me again in a few months," she said, "when we've weathered whatever storms are coming our way, when you're sure this arrangement is what you really want." James wanted to tell her that he was already sure, that the answer to his question was written in every kindness she showed his children, every moment of peace she brought to his home. But perhaps she was right. Perhaps they both needed time to be certain that what was growing between them was real and lasting, not just gratitude and loneliness wearing the mask of deeper feelings. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was coming. But inside, the kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the quiet contentment of a family settling into its evening routine. For now, that was enough. October arrived with a crisp promise of winter, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching the leaves dance in the morning breeze, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging that went deeper than mere acceptance. 6 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the rhythm of ranch life had begun to feel natural. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent her mornings tending the house and garden, her afternoons helping with whatever tasks needed doing, and her evenings mending clothes or reading to the children by lamplight. It was a simple life, perhaps even humble by the standards she'd known back east, but it was hers in a way nothing had ever been before. The garden she'd planted behind the house was thriving beyond her expectations. Neat rows of late vegetable carrots, turnips, winter squash promised, fresh food through the cold months ahead. She'd also established a small herb garden near the kitchen door, where sage and thyme and oregano grew with the hardy determination of plants that understood their purpose. "Ma?" Tommy's voice interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway, still in his nightshirt and rubbing sleep from his eyes. The word hit her like a physical blow, not of pain, but of overwhelming tenderness. Somewhere in the past weeks, both children had begun calling her Ma, without prompting or discussion. It had happened gradually, naturally, like water finding its level. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, opening her arms to receive his sleepy embrace. "Did you sleep well?" Tommy nodded against her shoulder, and Eleanor marveled again at how completely these children had accepted her into their lives. Perhaps it was their father's example. James had made it clear from the beginning that she was welcome, that she belonged her, Perhaps it was simply the resilience of youth. Either way, she was grateful. Sarah appeared a few minutes later, already dressed and with her hair braided, but she too came forward for her morning hug. The gesture would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, when the girl had watched Eleanor with the wary politeness of someone who'd learned not to get too attached to temporary arrangements. "Mrs. Fletcher asked if you might come to town today," Sarah said as Eleanor began preparing breakfast. "She said Mrs. Patterson is having her baby, and they could use an extra pair of hands." Eleanor paused in her egg cracking. She'd assisted at several births back in Boston, but this would be her first real test of community acceptance since the disastrous town meeting. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd ask you, but Ma," Sarah's voice carried a note of worry. "Some of the town ladies, they might not be very nice to you." "Let them try," Eleanor said mildly, but with an edge of steel that made both children look at her with new respect. "I've delivered babies in situations a lot more challenging than a roomful of disapproving women." The ride to town was crisp and pleasant, the autumn air carrying scents of wood smoke and dying leaves. James had insisted on driving her, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of handling the wagon herself. Now she was glad for his company, even though neither of them spoke much during the journey. Dr. Fletcher met them at the Patterson house, his usually cheerful face drawn with exhaustion. "Thank God you're here, Mrs. Cutter. This baby seems determined to arrive on its own schedule, and Mrs. Patterson is, well, she's having a difficult time." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves without hesitation. She'd assisted her own mother at dozens of births, had learned early that bringing new life into the world was messy, painful, and utterly miraculous work that required steady hands and a calm heart. The next 8 hours passed in a blur of hot water, clean linens, and the ancient dance of labor. Mrs. Patterson was young, barely 20, and this was her first child. She was frightened and exhausted, her husband pacing the front room like a caged animal while the women worked. Eleanor found herself taking charge with a natural authority that surprised even her. She directed Mrs. Fletcher and the other women with quiet efficiency, soothed Mrs. Patterson's fears with gentle words and cool cloths, and somehow managed to ignore the whispered comments about her unseemly knowledge of such matters. When baby Patterson finally made his appearance, a healthy, squalling boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin, Eleanor was the one who cleared his airways and placed him in his mother's arms for the first time. "He's perfect," Mrs. Patterson whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you so much." Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her throat that always came at these moments, the bittersweet joy of helping bring new life into the world when she'd never been blessed with children of her own. But today, for the first time, the pain was tempered by the knowledge that she did have children now. Sarah and Tommy might not have come from her body, but they were hers to love and protect and guide. As they cleaned up afterwards, Mrs. Prepley 7BH, Fletcher approached Eleanor with something like awe in her expression. "I've never seen anyone handle a difficult birth so calmly," she said. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mother was a midwife in Boston," Eleanor replied, scrubbing her hands in the wash basin. "I started helping her when I was Sarah's age. By the time I was grown, I'd assisted at more births than I could count." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "But you never, that is, you never pursued it as a profession?" Eleanor's smile was tinged with old sadness. "Unmarried women of a certain social standing don't pursue professions, Mrs. Fletcher. We pursue husbands. When that fails, we become useful to our families in other ways." The older woman studied Eleanor's face with new understanding. "Well," she said finally, "I hope you'll consider pursuing it here. We could certainly use someone with your skills." Word of Eleanor's competence spread quickly through the small community. Over the next few weeks, she found herself called upon for various medical emergencies, as treating a child's broken arm when Dr. Fletcher was out of town, helping with another difficult birth, even assisting with the care of old Mr. Henderson when his arthritis flared up. Each successful intervention earned her grudging respect from people who'd been quick to judge her character but couldn't argue with her results. It wasn't friendship, exactly, but it was a kind of acceptance based on demonstrated worth rather than social connections. The change was most noticeable in the children's attitudes. Sarah came home from school one afternoon with her chin held high and a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Jenny Morrison tried to say something mean about you today," she announced over dinner. "But Mary Henderson told her that you saved her baby brother when he was choking, and that her mama says you're the best nurse in the territory." Jenny didn't know what to say to that. Eleanor felt a warm glow of satisfaction. She'd never sought approval or recognition, but having her skills acknowledged felt like vindication for all the years she'd been dismissed as useless or unwanted. "That's very gratifying," she said mildly. "But remember, Sarah, we don't help people to earn praise. We help them because it's the right thing to do." "I know," Sarah said, "but it's still nice when people say good things about you instead of mean things." James had been watching this exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. After the children went to bed, he found her in the kitchen, cleaning the lamp chimneys by the light of a single candle. "You never told me about your medical experience," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Eleanor looked up from her work. "You never asked, and besides, it's not something most men find appealing in a wife. I learned early to keep such accomplishments to myself." "Well, that's their loss," James said firmly. "What you did today, the way you handled everything, it was remarkable." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the genuine admiration in his voice. "It was just practical knowledge, James. Nothing remarkable about it." "There is to me." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the calloused warmth of his palm, sending an unexpected shiver through her. "Eleanor, I want you to know what happened at that town meeting, the things people said. None of that matters to me. What matters is who you are, what you bring to our family, the difference you've made in our lives." Eleanor stared down at their joined hands, her heart beating faster than it should. "James, I know we agreed this was a practical arrangement," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "But it's become something more than that, at least for me. I can't promise it will be easy. There will always be people like Martha Hendricks who think they know what's best for everyone else. But I can promise that you'll always have a place here, that you'll always be welcome and wanted and loved." The last word hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time anyone had told her she was loved? When was the last time she'd felt worthy of love? "Ask me again in the spring," she whispered, echoing her words from weeks before. "When you've seen me through a full cycle of seasons, when you know all my faults and flaws and stubborn ways." James smiled, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I already know your stubborn ways, Mrs. Cutter. They're some of my favorite things about you." That night, as Eleanor lay in her narrow bed in the sewing room, she found herself thinking about the changes that had transformed her life in such a short time. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a spinster of 38, written off by the world as too old, too plain, too set in her ways to be of value to anyone. Now she was a wife, a mother, a valued member of a community that was slowly learning to see past their prejudices to the woman beneath. Outside her window, the autumn wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of winter and the deeper promise of seasons yet to come. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor Hart Cutter fell asleep with hope in her heart and the certain knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove her worth not to the world, but to the family that had claimed her as their own. The next morning brought the first frost of the season, silvering the grass and coating the windows with delicate tracery. Eleanor woke to find James already up and moving around the kitchen, making coffee with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to manage domestic tasks through necessity rather than inclination. "Morning," he said, looking up as she appeared in the doorway. "I thought I'd let you sleep a little longer after yesterday." "That's thoughtful but unnecessary." Eleanor replied, moving to take over the coffee preparation with the easy authority of someone who'd claimed the kitchen as her domain. "I'm not delicate, James. I don't need coddling." "No," he agreed, watching as she moved around the small space with unconscious grace. "You're not delicate at all. You're something much better. You're strong." Eleanor paused in her coffee-making, struck by the simple sincerity in his voice. In her experience, most men didn't value strength in women, preferring the more decorative qualities of youth and beauty and biddable temperament. James Cutter, it seemed, was not most men. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you might realize." As they worked together to prepare breakfast, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of James's presence in the small space. The way he moved with the economical grace of someone accustomed to physical work, the scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes, the rare moments when his hand brushed hers as they reached for the same item. It had been so long since she'd been this aware of a man as anything other than an obstacle or disappointment. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder that her heart was not as safely guarded as she'd believed. When the children joined them for breakfast, the easy domesticity of the scene struck Eleanor with unexpected force. This was what she'd dreamed of during all those years of watching other women's lives, from the sidelines, not the grand romance of novels, but the quiet contentment of shared meals and small daily kindnesses and the certain knowledge that she belonged somewhere, to someone. "Ma," Tommy said around a mouthful of eggs, "can we work in the garden today? I want to help harvest the carrots." "Of course," Eleanor replied, ruffling his sandy hair. "But first, you need to finish your breakfast and get ready for your lessons." She'd taken over the children's education, supplementing the sporadic schooling available in town with daily lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sarah was bright and eager to learn, while Tommy required more patience but rewarded her efforts with his infectious enthusiasm for new discoveries. As the morning progressed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the future in ways she'd avoided since her arrival. What would Christmas be like in this house? Would there be other children born to neighbors who might need her assistance? Would the garden produce enough vegetables to last through the winter, and what improvements might she make come spring? For the first time in her adult life, she was planning beyond the immediate moment, allowing herself to hope for a future that stretched out in front of her like an uncharted territory full of possibility. It was a dangerous luxury for a woman who'd learned to protect herself by expecting nothing, but it was also intoxicating in its promise of happiness she'd never dared to dream might be hers. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor looked out the window to see Dr. Fletcher riding up to the house with another man she didn't recognize. James went out to meet them, and she could see by his expression that the news they brought was serious. When he returned to the kitchen, his face was grim. "There's been trouble with rustlers again," he said. "They hit the Morrison place last night, made off with nearly 30 head of cattle." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, but they're getting bolder. Dr. Fletcher thinks they're working their way through the valley systematically, hitting one ranch at a time." James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Eleanor had learned meant he was worried. "I need to ride out with the other men, see what we can do to track them." "How long will you be gone?" "Could be a few days, depending on what we find." James looked at her with concern. "Will you be all right here alone with the children?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "James, I've been taking care of myself for 38 years. I think I can manage a few days on a ranch." "Of course you can," he said quickly. "I didn't mean. It's just that if these rustlers are as organized as they seem to be, then you'd better catch them before they decide to expand their activities," Eleanor said practically. "Take whatever time you need. We'll be fine." But as she watched him ride away with the other men, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile new happiness was about to face its first real test. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried with it the promise of change, whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The quilting frame had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by wagon from Santa Fe, along with the other supplies Eleanor had carefully ordered from her dwindling savings. She'd spent the previous evening sketching patterns by lamplight, her mind already envisioning the community of women who might gather around the large wooden frame that now dominated the front parlor. Sarah and Tommy had watched with fascination as Eleanor assembled the frame, her movements confident, despite the complexity of the apparatus. She'd learned quilting at her mother's knee, but this was the first time she'd ever had space enough to set up a proper frame for a full-sized quilt. "What's it for?" Tommy asked, running his small hands along the smooth wood. "It's for bringing people together," Eleanor replied, stretching the backing fabric across the frame with practiced efficiency. "A quilt needs many hands to make it well, and many hands need reasons to come together." She'd been thinking about isolation, not just her own, but that of all the ranch women scattered across the vast territory. During her weeks of medical calls and community service, she'd noticed how hungry the women seemed for female companionship, for the chance to share their struggles and triumphs with others who understood the particular challenges of frontier life. The invitation she'd composed was simple and carefully worded. "Ladies of Sage Creek and surrounding areas are cordially invited to join a quilting circle at the Cutter Ranch. Beginning this Saturday at 2 o'clock, come ready to sew, share, and enjoy the company of neighbors. Refreshments will be provided." She'd given copies to Mrs. Fletcher to distribute in town, and asked Sarah to take one to school to share with the other mothers. The response had been tentative but encouraging. 5 women had sent word that they would attend, including, to Eleanor's surprise, Mrs. Patterson, the young mother whose baby she'd helped deliver. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made the harsh New Mexico landscape seem almost gentle. Eleanor had spent the morning baking cookies, sweet bread, and a large pot of coffee that would stay warm throughout the afternoon. She'd chosen the pattern carefully, a traditional star design that would be beautiful but not so complex as to intimidate less experienced quilters. The first to arrive was Mrs. Fletcher, her kindly face beaming with enthusiasm as she carried in a basket of fabric scraps and sewing supplies. "I haven't been to a proper quilting circle in years," she confessed as Eleanor helped her settle at the frame. "In town, we're all so busy with our own concerns that we rarely make time for this kind of gathering." Mrs. Patterson came next, still moving carefully from her recent delivery, but glowing with the satisfaction of new motherhood. She brought her sister, a shy young woman named Lucy, who'd recently arrived from Kansas, to help with the baby. Eleanor was pleased to see that Margaret Walshben's wife had come despite her husband's vocal disapproval of the Cutter marriage. Margaret was a practical woman in her 40s who'd raised 4 children on a remote ranch and understood the value of female friendship in ways her husband never could. The last to arrive was Mrs. Henderson, accompanied by her teenage daughter Mary. Eleanor had worried that the older woman might come only to satisfy her curiosity or to report back to the town gossips, but Mrs. Dopplet Henderson's manner was genuinely friendly as she admired the quilt pattern and praised Eleanor's hospitality. "I brought some of my mother's fabric," she said, unpacking a collection of beautiful vintage prints. "She passed last spring, and I've been wondering what to do with all her sewing things. This seems like a fitting use for them." As the women settled around the frame, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of rightness settle over her. This was what she'd been missing during all those years of attending other people's social gatherings as an unwelcome spinster chance to be the hostess, to create the space where others could relax and connect. The conversation started tentatively, focused on technical matters of stitching and pattern placement. But as the afternoon progressed and the coffee flowed, the topics became more personal. Mrs. Lee Drylinez Patterson shared her struggles with new motherhood, while Mrs. Fletcher offered gentle advice based on her experience raising her own children. Margaret Walsh talked about the challenges of managing a household when her husband was frequently away on cattle business, and Mrs. Henderson reminisced about the early days of her marriage when the territory was even wilder and more isolated than it was now. Eleanor found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Boston, her mother's medical practice, the challenges of managing her family's affairs after her father's death. She was careful not to reveal too much about her previous romantic disappointments, but she spoke honestly about the loneliness of spinsterhood and her decision to come west. "I think you're very brave," young Lucy Patterson said quietly, her needle pausing in its work. "To come so far to marry a man you'd never met. I don't think I could have done it." "Desperation makes cowards of us all," Eleanor replied with gentle humor. "Sometimes the fear of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of change." "And now," Mrs. Fletcher asked, "do you regret the choice?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, her hands continuing their steady rhythm of stitching. Through the window, she could see Sarah and Tommy playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. James had been gone 3 days now, tracking the rustlers with the other men, and she found herself missing his quiet presence more than she'd expected. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. This place, this family, they've given me something I never thought I'd have: a sense of purpose, of belonging. Whatever challenges we face, I can't regret that." Margaret Walsh looked up from her careful stitching. "James is a good man," she said quietly. "I know my Ben was critical of his choice to marry you sight unseen. But I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you've fit yourself into this community, how you've cared for those children. You've proved yourself in ways that matter." The compliment was unexpected and deeply moving. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that acceptance could come from the most surprising quarters, that even those who'd initially judged her were capable of changing their minds when presented with evidence of her character. "Thank you," she managed. "That means a great deal to me." As the women worked, the quilt began to take shape under their combined efforts. The star pattern emerged slowly, each point carefully stitched and fitted into place. It was painstaking work that required patience and precision, but there was something deeply satisfying about watching beauty emerge from the careful accumulation of small, individual efforts. "My grandmother used to say that quilting was like life," Mrs. Henderson observed, her experienced hands guiding her needle with practiced ease. "Each piece looks insignificant on its own, but when you put them all together in the right pattern, you get something useful and beautiful." "And warm," added Mrs. Fletcher with a smile. "Don't forget warm. That's the most important part." Eleanor smiled at the gentle wisdom of these women, thinking about how accurately the metaphor applied to her own situation. 6 months ago, she'd felt like a discarded scrap, useful for nothing, wanted by no one. Now she was part of a larger pattern, her individual contributions combining with those of others to create something meaningful and lasting. The afternoon was winding down when the sound of approaching horses interrupted their peaceful work. Eleanor looked out the window to see James riding up to the house with Dr. Fletcher and several other men, their faces grim with exhaustion and frustration. "Looks like the men are back," Margaret Walsh observed, beginning to pack up her sewing supplies. "And from their expressions, I'd say the news isn't good." Eleanor excused herself to greet James, leaving the other women to finish their work and prepare to depart. She found him in the barn, unsaddling his horse with the slow, careful movements of someone who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Any luck?" she asked, though his expression had already given her the answer. James shook his head grimly. "They're professionals, whoever they are. Know the country better than we do, always seem to be one step ahead. We found signs of a camp, but they'd cleared out hours before we got there. How many cattle did they take from the Morrisons?" 30 head, like we thought, but that's not the worst of it." James hung up his saddle and turned to face her, his blue eyes dark with worry. "They hit the Jenkins place while we were out chasing shadows, got away with nearly 50 head this time, and they left a message." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What kind of message?" "Said they know which ranches have the best stock, and they'll be back for more. Warned against organizing any more pazzees." James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was deeply troubled. "Eleanor, I think they've been watching us. Watching all of us. They knew exactly when to hit the Jenkins place, knew we'd be miles away chasing their false trail." The implications were sobering. If the rustlers were that well organized, that well informed about the movements of the local ranchers, then no one was safe. Every ranch in the valley was vulnerable, and the traditional methods of dealing with cattle thieves' poses and tracking and frontier justice seemed inadequate against such a sophisticated operation. "What will you do?" Eleanor asked. "We're meeting tonight to discuss it. Some of the men want to hire professional help, Pinkertons or U.S. Marshals. Others think we should handle it ourselves, set traps, organize better patrols." James's expression was troubled. "The problem is, we don't know who we can trust. If they're getting information about our movements, someone must be passing it along." Eleanor felt a stab of unease. The idea that there might be a traitor among the tight-knit community was disturbing, but it would explain how the rustlers always seemed to know exactly when and where to strike. "James," she said carefully, "you don't think, that is, you don't suspect anyone in particular, do you?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I don't want to," he said finally. "These are men I've known for years, men I've trusted with my life and my family's safety. But the evidence, Eleanor, they're too well informed for this to be coincidence." The weight of suspicion settled over them like a dark cloud. Eleanor thought about the men who'd been at the town meeting, who'd questioned James's judgment in marrying her, who'd made it clear that they saw her as an outsider, a potential threat to their community's stability. "They might blame me," she said quietly. "Some people already think I'm a disruptive influence, if cattle start disappearing right after my arrival." "That's ridiculous," James said firmly. "You've been here helping with medical emergencies and community organizing. Anyone who knows you can see what kind of person you are." "But not everyone knows me," Eleanor pointed out. "And people under stress often look for simple explanations, convenient scapegoats." James's jaw tightened. "Let them try. They'll have to go through me first." Eleanor felt a warm rush of gratitude for his protection, even as she worried about the position it might put him in. If the community turned against her, James would be forced to choose between his neighbors and his wife, a choice that could isolate their family completely. That evening, as the women of the quilting circle prepared to leave, Eleanor found herself studying their faces with new awareness. These women had welcomed her into their circle, had shared their stories and their friendship. But if suspicion and fear took hold in the community, how long would such acceptance last? "Same time next week?" Mrs. Fletcher asked as she gathered her things. "Of course," Eleanor replied, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "I'll have the coffee ready." After the women left, Eleanor stood in her front parlor, looking at the quilt frame, at the partially completed star pattern that represented so much hope and community spirit. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was determined to preserve this small space of female fellowship she'd created. But as night fell and James rode out to meet with the other ranchers, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful afternoon of quilting might be one of the last they'd enjoy for some time. The rustlers were only part of the threat they faced. Fear and suspicion could destroy a community just as effectively as theft and violence, and she suspected they were about to learn that lesson firsthand. The letter arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by the same young Billy Morrison who'd brought the town meeting notice months earlier. But this time, his excitement was tinged with curiosity rather than malicious glee. The envelope bore an expensive Eastern postmark and Eleanor's maiden name written in elegant script. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately, though she hadn't seen it in over 3 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the letter, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them particularly welcome. "Ma?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you all right? You look pale." Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just surprised to receive mail from back east. Why don't you and Tommy finish your breakfast while I read this?" She retreated to the privacy of her sewing room, closing the door behind her before breaking the wax seal. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind her family had once used for important correspondence. Her eyes skimmed the familiar salutation before focusing on the content that would change everything. "My dearest Eleanor, I trust this letter finds you well, though I confess myself deeply concerned about the reports that have reached me regarding your current circumstances. Your brother William felt obligated to inform me of your situation, and I find I can no longer remain silent. Eleanor, surely you cannot be content with this rustic arrangement you've entered into. A woman of your education and refinement, reduced to keeping house for some frontier rancher and his children. It pains me beyond expression to think of you so far from civilization, so removed from the life you deserve. I have something of great importance to share with you, news that changes everything between us. Last month, I inherited my uncle's estatia, considerable fortune that makes my previous financial constraints irrelevant. I am now in a position to offer you the life I should have provided years ago. My dear Eleanor, I was young and foolish when I broke our engagement. I allowed financial considerations and family pressure to override the deeper feelings I harbored for you. I have regretted that decision every day since, but I was in no position to remedy it until now. I am prepared to travel to wherever this unfortunate marriage has taken you. We can have the union annulled quietly. I have consulted with attorneys who assure me it can be done with minimal scandal. You can return with me to Boston, where we will be married properly and take our rightful place in society. Think of it, Eleanor, no more provincial hardships, no more isolation from cultured society. You could have the home on Beacon Hill you always dreamed of, servants to manage the domestic concerns, and the freedom to pursue your interests without the burden of manual labor. I know this must come as a shock, but I beg you to consider my proposal carefully. I have made arrangements to travel west immediately upon sending this letter. By the time you read this, I will likely be only days away. Please, my dearest Eleanor, do not throw away this chance at the happiness that should have been ours from the beginning. I remain, as always, your devoted Charles Manning. Eleanor read the letter twice, her emotions cycling through surprise, anger, and a complex mixture of feelings she couldn't quite name. Charles Manning, the man who'd courted her seriously for 2 years, who'd spoken of marriage and shared dreams, who'd broken their engagement when he'd learned she wouldn't inherit her father's business. She folded the letter carefully and sat in the quiet of her small room, listening to the sounds of her current life. Sarah helping Tommy with his arithmetic, the coffee pot bubbling on the stove, James's voice in the yard as he spoke with one of the ranch hands. Simple sounds, domestic sounds, but they had become the symphony of her contentment. 3 months ago, Charles's letter would have represented salvation, a chance to escape the humiliation of spinsterhood and claim the respectable life she'd always been taught to want. Now, it felt like an intrusion, a voice from a past she'd left behind, calling her back to a future that no longer held appeal. But the letter raised questions she couldn't ignore. What if James's feelings for her were based more on gratitude and convenience than genuine love? What if this rough frontier life eventually wore away at whatever affection he felt for her? What if the community's hostility, currently held in check by her usefulness, eventually made their situation untenable? Eleanor, James's voice outside the door interrupted her churning thoughts. Everything all right? Sarah said you received some concerning news. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his face creased with worry. The genuine concern in his expression, the immediate assumption that her troubles were, his troubles struck her with unexpected force. It's complicated, she said carefully. Perhaps we could speak privately after the children are settled for the night. James nodded, though she could see the questions in his eyes. Of course, but Eleanor, whatever it is, we'll face it together. The simple certainty in his voice made her chest tight with emotion. When had anyone ever said such a thing to her? When had anyone ever assumed that her problems were worth sharing, worth solving together? The day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor went through the motions of her normal routine, helping the children with their lessons, preparing meals, tending to the endless tasks that kept a ranch household running. But her mind kept returning to Charles's letter, to the choice it represented, to the life she'd built here and the life she was being offered. That evening, after Sarah and Tommy had been tucked into bed, Eleanor and James sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the weight of unspoken words between them. She'd placed the letter on the table between them, unopened but somehow menacing in its expensive elegance. "From someone you knew back east?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor nodded. "Charles Manning, a man I was engaged to marry some years ago." She saw James's jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained calm. "I see. And what does he want?" "To resume our engagement, to take me back to Boston." Eleanor's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the complete upheaval of their lives. "He's inherited money, it seems, enough to make the financial considerations that ended our engagement irrelevant." James was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled. "And what do you want?" The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "I don't know," she admitted. 3 months ago, I would have known immediately. Charles represents everything I was raised to. Want security, social position, a comfortable life in familiar surroundings. And now?" Eleanor looked around the kitchen that had become so dear to her, the worn wooden table where she helped the children with their lessons, the stove she'd learned to manage, the window that looked out over the garden she'd planted with her own hands. "Now I know that comfort isn't the same as happiness," she said quietly. "That security means nothing if it's built on someone else's sense of obligation rather than genuine feeling." James leaned forward, his blue eyes intent on her face. "Eleanor, do you think my feelings for you are based on obligation?" The direct question forced her to confront her deepest fears. "I think you're a good man who's grateful for the help I've provided with your children and your household. I think you've grown fond of me, perhaps even care for me. But love?" She shook her head. "James, we've known each other for such a short time. How can either of us be certain what we feel is real?" "How can we be certain it isn't?" he countered. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about Mary a lot lately, not with guilt, but with gratitude. She taught me what love could be, what it felt like to share my life with someone who understood me, who made me want to be better than I was." He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "What I feel for you, it's different from what I felt for Mary, but it's no less real. Mary was the love of my youth, when everything seemed possible and the future stretched endlessly ahead. You're the love of my maturity, when I understand the value of what I'm being offered." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "And what if Charles is right? What if this life, this place, eventually wears away whatever feelings you have for me? What if the community pressure becomes too much? What if the isolation and hardship?" "Eleanor." James's voice was firm, cutting through her spiraling fears. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing in them a steadiness that calmed her racing heart. "I'm 42 years old," he said quietly. "I've buried one wife, raised 2 children largely on my own, built a life from nothing in country that doesn't forgive mistakes. I know hardship, and I know the difference between gratitude and love." He stood and moved to her side of the table, kneeling beside her chair so their faces were level. "What I feel for you isn't gratitude, though I am grateful. It isn't convenience, though you've certainly made my life easier. It's love, Eleanor, the real thing, the kind that grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker." Eleanor searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. She found none. "But how can you be sure?" she whispered. "Because I've spent 3 days without you," he said simply. 3 days tracking rustlers and worrying about cattle and thinking every moment about coming home to you. Not to my house, not to my children, though I love them dearly, but to you. Because you've become the center of everything, the reason the work matters, the reason the future looks bright instead of just bearable." Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble. "James, I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love your stubborn independence, your quiet strength, the way you've made my children smile again. I love how you take on the town gossips without flinching, how you've built a community of women in our front parlor, how you make everything better just by being part of it." Eleanor was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of loneliness and self-doubt began to dissolve. "I love you too." she whispered. "I've been afraid to admit it, afraid to hope it was real, but I love you so much it scares me." James cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Then what Charles Manning offers doesn't matter, does it? Whatever he can give you, whatever life he's promising, it doesn't include this, it doesn't include us." Eleanor nodded, feeling a certainty settle in her chest like warmth spreading through cold bones. "No, it doesn't. And I don't want a life that doesn't include you, doesn't include Sarah and Tommy, doesn't include this place we've built together." When James kissed her, it was soft and sweet and full of promise. Eleanor felt herself melting into him, into the warmth and safety of being truly wanted, truly loved, for exactly who she was. They were interrupted by a small sound from the doorway. Tommy, rubbing his eyes and looking confused by the sight of his parents embracing in the kitchen. "Ma, Papa, are you sad?" he asked, noting Eleanor's tear-stained cheeks. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the quiet room. "No, sweetheart, we're happy, very, very happy." James scooped Tommy up in his arms. "What are you doing out of bed, son?" "I heard voices, and I thought maybe—" Tommy's face grew serious. "I thought maybe Ma might leave, like Mama did." Eleanor's heart clenched at the unconscious fear in the child's voice. She stood and put her arms around both of them, creating a circle of warmth and security. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my home, and you're my family. Nothing is going to change that." Tommy smiled and snuggled closer, apparently satisfied by her declaration. As James carried him back to bed, Eleanor picked up Charles's letter and fed it to the fire, watching the expensive paper curl and blacken and disappear. When James returned, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky above their ranch. "Any regrets?" he asked, moving to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "None," she said softly. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of winter and the deeper promise of love that had found its way across vast distances to bloom in the most unexpected places. Whatever challenges lay ahead, rustlers, community pressure, the harsh realities of frontier life, they would face them together, as husband and wife, as partners in the truest sense of the word. Eleanor Hartcutter had finally come home. Charles Manning arrived in Sage Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, stepping off the stagecoach with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his expectations met. He was handsome in the polished way of Eastern gentlemen, tall, well-dressed, with graying temples that added distinction to his aristocratic features. His clothes were expensive, his manner assured, and he carried himself like someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Eleanor first learned of his arrival when Sarah burst through the kitchen door, her eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Ma, there's a fancy man in town asking questions about you," she announced breathlessly. "Mrs. Fletcher sent me to tell you. He's staying at the hotel and telling everyone he's here to see Mrs. Eleanor Hart." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Despite having burned his letter weeks ago, despite the certainty she'd felt in James's arms, Charles's actual presence felt like a thunderclap in their peaceful world. She'd hoped he might change his mind about the journey, might decide the effort wasn't worth the uncertain outcome. "What kind of questions?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "About where you live, how long you've been married, whether you're happy." Sarah's young face was troubled. "Ma, why would a stranger be asking such things?" Before Eleanor could answer, the sound of an approaching carriage drew their attention to the window. A hired buggy was making its way up the lane to their house, driven by Tom Fletcher and carrying a passenger who could only be Charles Manning. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time to prepare, more time to shore up her defenses against the man who'd once held her heart and discarded it when convenience demanded. "Sarah, take Tommy upstairs," she said quietly. "Stay there until I call for you." "But Ma..." Please, sweetheart, this is adult business that doesn't concern children. Sarah nodded reluctantly and gathered her brother, both children casting worried glances over their shoulders as they disappeared upstairs. Eleanor smoothed her skirts, checked her reflection in the kitchen window, and prepared to face the ghost of her former life. Charles Manning stepped down from the buggy with fluid grace, his eyes scanning the modest ranch house and surrounding buildings with barely concealed dismay. Eleanor could see him taking inventory, the simple wooden construction, the functional rather than decorative architecture, the obvious signs of a working ranch rather than a gentleman's estate. She opened the door before he could knock, stepping onto the porch with her chin raised and her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Hello, Charles." Eleanor. His voice was warm, cultured, exactly as she remembered. "My dear, you look well." The slight hesitation suggested he was struggling to find something complimentary to say about her appearance, which had been weathered by months of frontier sun and outdoor work. "Thank you. You look prosperous." It wasn't entirely a compliment, but Charles chose to take it as one, his smile broadening with satisfaction. "May I come in? We have a great deal to discuss." Eleanor hesitated. Inviting him into her home felt like a betrayal of the life she'd built here, but refusing would only create more gossip and speculation. "Of course, but Charles, I should tell you." "Please, let me speak first." He followed her into the front parlor, where the quilting frame still held the star pattern she and the other women had been working on. His eyes fell on it with obvious puzzlement. "Eleanor, what is this?" "A quilting frame. I've started a circle for the local women." Eleanor heard the defensive note in her own voice and straightened her shoulders. "It's become quite popular." Charles stared at the frame as if it were some primitive artifact from an alien civilization. "You're quilting? Eleanor, surely you remember your education, your accomplishments. Piano, French, literature, and now you're engaged in domestic crafts." The condescension in his voice sparked Eleanor's temper. "I'm engaged in building a community, Charles, in creating connections with my neighbors and contributing something meaningful to their lives." "Your neighbors?" Charles looked around the simple room with its handmade furniture and practical decorations. "Eleanor, these people, they're not our kind. You don't belong in this rustic environment, playing house with some frontier farmer. James is a rancher, not a farmer, and this isn't playing house, this is my life." Charles moved closer, his expression softening into the charm she remembered all too well. "My dear, I understand. You were desperate, alone, with limited options. You made the best choice available to you at the time, but that's changed now." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Eleanor recognized the expensive legal paper immediately. "Annulment papers," Charles explained. "My attorneys have assured me that a marriage of such short duration, entered into under circumstances of economic necessity, can be dissolved quietly and without scandal." Eleanor stared at the papers without touching them. "You're very sure of yourself." "I'm sure of us," Charles corrected. "Eleanor, I've spent 3 years regretting my decision to end our engagement. 3 years watching other men marry inferior women, while the woman I truly cared for remained unmarried and alone. I'm not unmarried and alone anymore." "Aren't you?" Charles gestured around the room. "Look at this place, Eleanor. Look at what you've been reduced to. You, who could have been mistress of one of the finest homes in Boston, keeping house for a rancher and his children in the middle of nowhere." Eleanor felt her temper rising, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, she could see James riding up to the house with Dr. Fletcher and 2 other men she didn't recognize. "Your husband, I presume," Charles said, moving to the window for a better look. "He appears rustic." Eleanor watched James dismount and speak briefly with the other men before heading toward the house. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the grim set of his mouth that meant trouble. James entered the house without knocking, stopping short when he saw the well-dressed stranger standing in his front parlor. His eyes immediately went to Eleanor, searching her face for signs of distress. "James," Eleanor said carefully, "this is Charles Manning, the gentleman from Boston I mentioned." James's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw his hands clench slightly at his sides. "Mr. Manning, I understand you've come a long way to see my wife." Charles stepped forward with an easy smile, extending his hand. "Mr. Cutter, yes, I have. Eleanor and I have unfinished business to discuss." James shook the offered hand briefly, his grip firm enough to make Charles wince slightly. "What kind of business?" "The kind that concerns Eleanor's future," Charles replied smoothly. "Her real future, not this temporary arrangement she's entered into." Eleanor saw James's jaw tighten. "My marriage to Eleanor isn't a temporary arrangement, Mr. Manning. It's a permanent commitment." "Entered into under false pretenses," Charles said, his tone becoming sharper. "Eleanor, show him the papers. Explain about your inheritance." Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways. "What inheritance?" Charles's smile was triumphant. "Your father's will, my dear, the one that was misfiled for so many years. It seems your brother William wasn't entirely honest about the terms of your father's estate." He produced another set of documents from his coat. "You inherited a substantial portion of Hart Shipping, Eleanor, enough to make you independently wealthy. William has been managing it as trustee, but the income is rightfully yours." Eleanor stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. My father left everything to William. I was told—" "You were told what William wanted you to believe," Charles interrupted. "He knew that if you understood your true circumstances, you might make decisions he couldn't control. Better to let you think yourself dependent on his charity." James stepped closer to Eleanor, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of her spinning world. "What does this mean?" Charles answered before Eleanor could speak. "It means she doesn't need this marriage, this life. She has the means to live anywhere she chooses, to do anything she wants. She could return to Boston with me and claim her rightful place in society." Eleanor looked at the legal documents in her hands, trying to process their implications. If Charles was telling the truth, if she truly had inherited money from her father, then everything she'd believed about her circumstances, her choices, her desperation that had led her to answer James's advertisement. "Eleanor," James said quietly, "are you all right?" She looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes, the fear he was trying to hide. He thought she was going to leave. He thought this revelation would change everything between them. "I need to understand," she said carefully. "Charles, these documents, they're genuine." "Completely. I've had them verified by 3 different law firms. Eleanor, you own shares in one of Boston's most successful shipping companies. The income alone would allow you to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Eleanor sank into a chair, the weight of this revelation settling over her like a lead blanket. "William knew? All these years he knew? He knew, and he allowed you to believe yourself dependent on his generosity while he profited from managing your inheritance." Charles's voice was gentle now, understanding. "My dear, you came here because you thought you had no other choice. But you do have choices. You have options you never knew existed." James was watching Eleanor's face with growing apprehension. "Eleanor?" She looked up at him, this man who'd offered her marriage when she'd thought herself worthless, who'd defended her against community criticism, who'd made her feel loved and valued for the first time in her adult life. "James," she said slowly, "what if Charles is right? What if I only married you because I thought I had no other choice? What if my feelings? What if they're based on gratitude rather than love?" The words hung in the air like a physical blow. James stepped back as if she'd struck him, his face going pale. "Do you believe that?" he asked quietly. Eleanor stared at the papers in her lap, her mind churning with doubt and confusion. 3 months ago, she'd been desperate enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger. Now she was being told she'd never needed to make that choice, that she'd had means and options she'd never known about. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Charles moved to her side, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Eleanor, you don't have to decide immediately. Come back to Boston with me. see your inheritance, understand your options. If you still choose to return here, I'll accept your decision. And if I don't return, then we'll be married as we should have been years ago, and you'll take your rightful place in the society you were born to." Eleanor looked between the two men, Charles with his confident smile and expensive clothes, James with his weathered hands and worried eyes. One represented security, status, the life she'd been trained to want. The other represented the life she'd built, the love she'd found, the family she'd come to cherish. "I need time to think," she said finally. James's expression was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the hurt beneath. "How much time?" "I don't know. This changes everything, James. Everything I thought I knew about my situation, my choices." "It doesn't change how I feel about you," James said quietly. "But it might change how I feel about myself," Eleanor replied, the honesty of the admission painful for both of them. Charles stepped forward. "The stagecoach leaves for Santa Fe tomorrow morning. From there, we can catch the train to Boston. Eleanor, whatever you decide, you deserve to make that choice with full knowledge of your circumstances." Eleanor nodded slowly, though the motion felt like betrayal. "Tomorrow morning. I'll have an answer by then." James turned and walked out of the house without another word, leaving Eleanor alone with Charles and the weight of a decision that would determine the rest of her life. Through the window, she could see James standing by the corral, his shoulders rigid with tension. In just a few minutes, her carefully constructed world had been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure if anything would ever be the same again. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her small sewing room, looking at the wedding dress hanging from the wooden peg on the wall. It wasn't the elaborate silk and lace confection she might have worn in a Boston cathedral, but a simple dress of blue wool that she'd sewn herself for her marriage to James. The fabric was practical, durable, chosen for its ability to serve double duty as both wedding gown and Sunday best. Now, as she contemplated leaving everything behind, the dress seemed to mock her with its modest simplicity. Had she settled for less than she deserved? Had desperation made her grateful for scraps when she could have had a feast? The questions had tormented her through a sleepless night, and dawn brought no answers, only the pressing weight of a decision that had to be made within hours. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Sarah or Tommy. Instead, James appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully controlled. "I wanted to speak with you before you made your decision." Eleanor gestured to the small chair by the window, but James remained standing, as if preparing to receive a blow that would knock him down. "I've been thinking about what Manning said," he began quietly, "about you only marrying me because you thought you had no choice." "James, let me finish." His voice was steady, but Eleanor could see the pain beneath his calm exterior. "Maybe he's right. Maybe you did marry me out of desperation. But Eleanor, I married you out of hope." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "Hope? Hope that I could love again. Hope that my children could have a mother who would truly care for them. Hope that I could build something lasting with a woman who understood what it meant to start over." James's blue eyes met hers directly. "Whatever your reasons were for coming here, whatever choices you thought you were making or not making, I need you to know that loving you has been the most honest thing I've done in years." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but James held up a hand. "I won't try to convince you to stay," he continued. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. If you leave, if you choose the life Manning is offering, I'll understand. You deserve to have choices, real choices, not decisions forced by circumstance." "And if I stay?" James was quiet for a long moment. "If you stay, it has to be because you want this life, this family, this man who loves you. Not because you're grateful, not because you feel obligated, but because this is where you choose to be." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "James, I'm so confused. Yesterday I knew exactly who I was, what I wanted. Now you know you have options," James said gently. "That's not something to regret, Eleanor. That's something to celebrate, even if it makes the choice harder." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Eleanor could see Charles riding up in his hired buggy, accompanied by Tom Fletcher, and to her surprise, several other men from town, including Ben Walsh and Reverend Morrison. "What's this about?" Eleanor asked. James's expression grew grim. "I suspect Manning has been busy spreading his version of your story around town. People are curious about your circumstances." Eleanor felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What kind of curious?" Before James could answer, Charles's voice could be heard outside, speaking loudly enough to be clearly audible through the windows. "Quite a fortune, actually. More than enough to live comfortably anywhere she chooses. Of course, she had no idea when she entered into this arrangement. Rather changes things, doesn't it?" Eleanor saw James's jaw tighten. "He's making it sound like our marriage was a business transaction that's no longer necessary. Isn't that what some people already believe?" "Some people are idiots," James said flatly, "but when those idiots start getting ideas about what's best for other people's lives..." Eleanor understood. Charles's revelation about her inheritance hadn't just changed her circumstances, had given the town gossips new ammunition. If she'd married James out of desperation rather than choice, if she now had the means to live independently, then perhaps their hasty union really was the moral scandal Martha Hendricks had claimed it to be. A sharp knock at the front door prevented further speculation. Eleanor smoothed her skirts and went to answer it, James close behind her. Charles stood on the porch with what appeared to be half the town's male population. Ben Walsh, Dr. Fletcher, Reverend Morrison, and several other men she recognized but didn't know well. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned to quietly hostile. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said coolly, "what can I do for you?" Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his thin face wearing an expression of pastoral concern. "Mrs. Cutter, we've come to offer our assistance in what must be a very difficult situation." "What situation is that, Reverend?" "Well, the circumstances that Mr. Manning has brought to our attention," the minister said carefully. "Your inheritance, and the questions it raises about your marriage." Eleanor felt James tense beside her. "What questions?" Ben Walsh spoke up, his voice uncomfortable but determined. "Eleanor, Mrs. Cutter, we all know you're a decent woman who found herself in unfortunate circumstances. If you married James because you felt you had no choice, well, that's understandable. But now that your situation has changed..." "Now that I have money, you mean?" Eleanor said flatly. "Now that you have options," Charles corrected smoothly. "Eleanor, these gentlemen are concerned about your welfare. They understand that a marriage entered into under duress, without full knowledge of your circumstances, might not be binding in a moral sense." Eleanor stared at the assembled men, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. They weren't here to support her, they were here to give her permission, even encouragement, to leave. Whether it was motivated by genuine concern for her welfare or by their ongoing discomfort with James's choice of bride, the result was the same. "I see," she said quietly. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Dr. Fletcher cleared his throat. "We're suggesting that you take time to consider your options carefully. Mr. Manning has offered to escort you back east, where you can. Reassess your situation with the benefit of full information. And if I choose to stay..." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Reverend Morrison spoke. "Of course, that would be your choice to make. But Eleanor, Mrs. Cutter, you're a woman of education and refinement. You deserve a life that matches your station, your means." Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "And James doesn't deserve a wife who chose him freely?" "That's not what we're saying," Ben Walsh protested. "We're saying you should have the chance to make that choice with full knowledge of your alternatives. The chance to leave without feeling guilty about it," Eleanor translated. The silence that followed was telling. These men, some of whom had been James's friends and neighbors for years, were essentially telling her that her marriage was a mistake that could be corrected without shame or censure. Eleanor looked at James, seeing the rigid control in his posture, the careful blankness of his expression. He was watching his community, his supposed friends, encourage his wife to leave him, and he was saying nothing in his own defense. That silence, more than anything else, clarified her thoughts with startling suddenness. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned during years of managing her family's business affairs, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." Charles frowned. "What kind of misunderstanding? You seem to believe that having money changes my feelings about my husband and my marriage." Eleanor stepped closer to James, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Let me clarify something for you. I didn't marry James because I was desperate. I married him because I wanted to build a life with him." "But the circumstances," Reverend Morrison began. "The circumstances were that I was alone and he was alone, and we both had the courage to hope that two people could make something better together than they could apart." Eleanor's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Money doesn't change that. Money doesn't change the fact that I love my husband, that I love his children, that I love the life we've built together." She turned to Charles, seeing the confusion and frustration in his face. "Charles, I'm grateful that you brought me this information about my inheritance. I'm grateful to know that my brother has been deceiving me for years. But I'm not grateful for the assumption that having money means I should want a different life." "Eleanor, be reasonable," Charles said. "You could have anything you want." "I already have everything I want," Eleanor interrupted. "I have a husband who loves me for who I am, not for what I bring to the marriage. I have children who need me and trust me. I have a community where my skills and efforts matter. Why would I trade that for a life where my value is measured by my bank account?" Ben Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "But Mrs. Cutter, surely you can see that your social position might be different now that—" "My social position," Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Gentlemen, let me tell you about social position. For 15 years, I held a respected place in Boston society as the unmarried daughter of a successful businessman. I attended the right parties, knew the right people, followed all the rules of proper behavior. And you know what that got me? Loneliness. A life lived entirely for the approval of others, with no real purpose or meaning." She gestured toward the quilting frame visible through the front window. "In 3 months here, I've helped deliver babies, taught children to read, organized a community of women who support each other through difficult times. I've used skills I never knew I had and found strength I never knew I possessed. That's worth more than any inheritance." James had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "I think what my wife is trying to tell you, gentlemen, is that your assistance isn't needed. We're quite capable of managing our own affairs." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. The assembled men began to shuffle their feet, looking anywhere but at James's face. Charles, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. The shock of learning about your inheritance, the pressure of making such a momentous decision." "Charles," Eleanor's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "I am thinking more clearly than I have in years. And what I'm thinking is that you've wasted a very expensive trip." She moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough to see the genuine bewilderment in his eyes. "You keep talking about what I deserve, what I should want, what would make me happy. But you've never once asked me what I actually do want, what actually does make me happy. I know you, Eleanor. I know what you value. You knew a woman who was desperate for approval, for security, for someone to tell her she had worth." Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. "I'm not that woman anymore. I've learned that real security comes from being loved for who you are, not what you have. Real worth comes from what you contribute, not what you inherit." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the annulment papers Charles had given her the day before. Without hesitation, she tore them in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. "There's your answer, Charles. I'm staying here with my husband in the life I've chosen, not because I have to, but because I want to." The silence that followed was profound. Charles stared at the scattered papers as if they represented the destruction of his carefully laid plans, which, Eleanor reflected, they did. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, his voice tight with frustration. You're throwing away opportunities that most women would kill for. I'm choosing love over opportunity, Eleanor corrected. And that's not a mistake, that's wisdom. Charles looked around at the assembled men, perhaps hoping for support, but found only uncomfortable faces and averted gazes. Even those who had been most critical of Eleanor's marriage seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something they shouldn't interfere with. Very well, Charles said stiffly. I'll catch this morning's stage back to Santa Fe. But Eleanor, when this rustic fantasy loses its appeal, when you remember what civilization has to offer. I won't, Eleanor said simply. Goodbye, Charles. She turned and walked back into the house, James beside her, leaving the assembled men to sort out their own confusion and disappointment. Through the window, she watched as they gradually dispersed, Charles stalking back to his hired buggy with the rigid dignity of a man whose certainties had been shattered. Well, James said quietly, closing the door behind them, that was definitive. Eleanor turned to face him, seeing the wonder and relief beginning to replace the careful control in his expression. I hope so, because, James, I need you to understand something. What's that? Eleanor took his hands in hers, holding his gaze with her own. I didn't stay because I couldn't leave. I stayed because I couldn't bear to leave. There's a difference, and it's important that you know it. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, as if afraid she might evaporate. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I love you so much I can barely breathe when I think about losing you. You're not going to lose me, Eleanor whispered back. I'm yours, James Cutter, for as long as you'll have me. Forever then, James said, pulling back to look at her face. Forever and always. Eleanor smiled, feeling the last of her doubts dissolve like morning mist. Forever sounds perfect. Outside, they could hear the sounds of normal ranch life, resuming cattle lowing, horses moving, the everyday business of a working spread. But inside the house, Eleanor and James stood wrapped in each other's arms, knowing that they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger than before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as husband and wife, as partners in the truest sense of the word. Eleanor Hart Cutter had made her choice, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. The attack came at dawn, just as Charles Manning's stagecoach disappeared over the eastern ridge, carrying with it the last remnants of Eleanor's former life. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the dust settle from his departure, when the first shots rang out across the valley. James dropped his coffee cup, the china shattering against the wooden floor as he lunged for the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace. Get the children, he said tersely, his movements swift and economical. Take them to the root cellar and stay there. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. James, what's happening? Rustlers, he said grimly, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. They've been watching, waiting for the right moment. With half the men in town distracted by Manning's arrival yesterday. Another volley of gunshots echoed from the direction of the main pasture, followed by the distinctive sound of cattle in distress, the panicked lowing that meant the herd was being driven hard and fast. Eleanor could see dust clouds rising beyond the barn, too much dust for their own cattle moving peacefully to new grazing. Ma, Papa, Sarah's voice carried from upstairs, high with fear. I'll get the children, Eleanor said, but James caught her arm. Eleanor, these aren't ordinary cattle thieves. They're organized, well-armed, and they don't leave witnesses. His blue eyes were deadly serious. Promise me you'll stay hidden until it's over. Eleanor looked at this man she'd chosen over wealth and comfort, seeing the determination in his face, the quiet courage that had first drawn her to him. I promise I'll protect the children, she said carefully. But James, I won't hide while you face this alone. You won't be hiding, you'll be keeping Sarah and Tommy safe. That's the most important thing you can do. More gunshots erupted, closer this time. Through the window, Eleanor could see riders approaching the house at least 6 men on horseback, their faces masked with bandanas, their movements coordinated with military precision. Go, James said urgently. Now. Eleanor ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She found Sarah and Tommy huddled together in the hallway, both children pale with fear but trying to be brave. "Come with me," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "We're going to play a hiding game, but it's very important that you do exactly what I say." She led them quickly through the kitchen and out the back door, staying low and moving fast toward the small root cellar James had dug into the hillside behind the house. The wooden door was heavy, designed to keep the cold in and everything else out. "Sarah, I need you to take care of Tommy," Eleanor said as she settled the children in the dark, earth-smelling space. "No matter what you hear, no matter how frightened you get, you stay here until Papa or I come to get you. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded solemnly, her arm around her little brother. "But Ma, what about you?" "I'm going to help your father," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure how. "You promised Papa you'd stay hidden," Sarah said, her young face creased with worry. Eleanor knelt down to their level, looking into their frightened faces. "Sarah, sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices. Your father needs help, and I can't stay safe while he's in danger. But I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to keep all of us safe." She kissed both children quickly, then closed the cellar door firmly behind her. From inside, she could hear Tommy beginning to cry softly, muffled by Sarah's comforting whispers. Eleanor crept back toward the house, staying low and using the outbuildings for cover. The sounds of conflict were growing louder, men shouting, horses neighing, the sharp crack of rifle fire. As she rounded the corner of the barn, she could see the full scope of what they were facing. At least 8 armed men had surrounded the house and immediate grounds. They'd clearly planned this assault carefully, timing it for when most of the neighboring ranchers would be away from their properties. James was barricaded inside the house, returning fire through the windows, but he was vastly outnumbered. Eleanor's mind raced, cataloging possibilities. She knew there were more rifles in the barn, along with ammunition James had stored for emergencies. If she could reach them, if she could get into position. But first, she needed to understand the rustlers' plan. Were they here just for the cattle, or was this something more sinister? Her question was answered when she heard one of the masked men shout orders to the others. "Keep him pinned down while we load the rest of the herd. Martinez, you and Collins check the outbuildings for anything valuable, and remember no witnesses." Eleanor's blood chilled. These men weren't just thieves, they were killers, and they intended to make sure no one survived to identify them or testify about their activities. Moving carefully, she made her way to the barn, slipping inside through the small side door James used for daily chores. The interior was dim and filled with the comforting smells of hay and leather, but Eleanor had no time to appreciate the familiar scents. She found the cache of weapons James had stored in a wooden crate beneath the hayloft too, more rifles and boxes of ammunition. Eleanor had never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched James clean and maintain his weapons enough times to understand the basic mechanics. She loaded one of the rifles with hands that shook only slightly, her mind focused on the task at hand rather than her fear. Through the barn's windows, she could see the rustlers' positions, could plan her approach. But as she prepared to move, the barn door burst open. 2 men entered, both armed and moving, with the confidence of predators who'd cornered their prey. "Well, well," said the taller of the two, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile visible above his bandana. "Looks like we missed someone." Eleanor raised the rifle, hoping her inexperience didn't show. "Stay back." The man laughed. "Lady, you're holding that rifle like it's a snake that might bite you. You ever even fired one of those things?" "Do you want to find out?" Eleanor asked, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. The second rustler, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just tie her up and—" "No witnesses," the leader said firmly. "Boss was very clear about that." Eleanor saw the decision in his eyes a split second before he moved. She pulled the trigger, the rifle bucking hard against her shoulder and the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Her shot went wide, splintering the wooden wall behind the men, but it was close enough to make them dive for cover. "She's got teeth," the leader snarled, rolling behind a hay bale. "Collins, flank her from the left." Eleanor levered another round into the chamber, her movements clumsy but determined. She'd grown up in a house where hunting was considered a gentleman's sport, had heard her father and brother discuss strategy and tactics over dinner. Now she found herself drawing on those overheard conversations, trying to think tactically rather than simply react in fear. The barn had multiple exits, and these men knew the building's layout as well as she did. They'd clearly been watching the ranch for weeks, learning its routines, its vulnerabilities. Eleanor needed to get outside, needed to reach James or find a better defensive position. A shot splintered the wood near her head, and Eleanor dropped to her knees behind a feed trough. Her position was untenable. She was trapped in a building with two armed men who knew exactly where she was. But then she heard something that changed everything, the sound of approaching horses, moving fast and in formation. Through the barn's windows, she could see a cloud of dust on the eastern horizon, growing larger by the moment. "Company coming," she heard one of the rustlers mutter. "Looks like a lot of company." The cavalry charge wasn't cavalry at all. It was the neighbors, led by Dr. Fletcher and Ben Walsh, riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. Eleanor had never been so grateful to see Ben Walsh in her life, despite his previous criticism of her marriage. The rustlers in the barn heard the approaching riders too. "We need to get out of here," the younger man said urgently. "Boss said if the neighbors showed up." "I know what the boss said," the leader snapped. "But we're not leaving empty-handed." Eleanor heard them moving, trying to position themselves for a quick escape while still maintaining their advantage over her. She gripped the rifle tighter, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived to see her children again. Through the barn walls, she could hear the battle intensifying as the neighbors engaged the main group of rustlers. James's voice carried above the noise, shouting instructions and coordinating the defense of his property. But Eleanor's immediate concern was the two men in the barn with her, men who had made it clear they intended to leave no witnesses to their crimes. She thought of Sarah and Tommy hiding in the root cellar, thought of James fighting for his life and his property, thought of the life she'd chosen over comfort and security. She would not let these men destroy everything she'd found here. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and prepared to fight for her family. The explosion of gunfire outside the barn told Eleanor that the neighbors had engaged the main body of rustlers, but her immediate concern remained, the two armed men who were systematically working their way toward her position. She could hear them moving through the hay bales, their boots scraping against the wooden floor as they tried to flank her. Eleanor clutched the family Bible that had been sitting on the feed bin beside her, its worn leather cover smooth from years of handling. James's grandmother had carried it west in a covered wagon, and now it seemed to anchor Eleanor to the generations of strong women who had faced danger with courage. "Listen, lady," the leader called out, his voice deceptively reasonable. "We don't want to hurt you, but we can't have you identifying us to the law. You make this easy on yourself, and we'll make it quick." Eleanor's response was to fire another shot in his direction, the bullet splintering the wooden post he was using for cover. Her aim was improving with practice, though she was burning through ammunition faster than she could afford. "She's getting better with that rifle," the younger rustler muttered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear the nervousness in his voice. "Shut up, Collins," the leader snapped. "She's just a woman playing with a gun she doesn't understand." But Eleanor was beginning to understand more than he realized. She was learning the rhythm of reload and fire, learning to anticipate their movements, learning to use the barn's layout to her advantage. More importantly, she was learning something about herself, that when the people she loved were threatened, she was capable of a fierceness she'd never suspected. Through the barn walls, she could hear James's voice rising above the chaos outside, coordinating the defense with the arrival of their neighbors. "Ben, take your men around the south side. Dr. Fletcher, can you get a clear shot at the riders by the corral?" The sound of his voice, strong and commanding, filled Eleanor with determination. He was alive, he was fighting, and she would not let these men in the barn prevent her from reuniting with her family. A movement in her peripheral vision warned her just in time. Collins had managed to work his way around to her left flank, just as his partner had planned. Eleanor spun and fired, her shot catching the young rustler in the shoulder and sending him spinning to the ground with a cry of pain and surprise. "Collins," the leader shouted, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "You said she couldn't shoot." "She's learning fast," Collins gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Boss, we need to get out of here. That shoulder feels like it's on fire." Eleanor levered another round into the chamber, her confidence growing with each successful shot. "You should have thought of that before you decided to rob my husband's ranch." The leader's response was a rapid series of shots that forced Eleanor to dive behind a pile of grain sacks. She could hear him moving again, trying to close the distance while she was pinned down. But then the barn door burst open again, and James appeared in the doorway, his rifle ready and his face grim with determination. "Eleanor?" "Two of them," she called back. "One wounded, behind the hay bales on the left. The other—" James's rifle cracked, and the leader's return shot went wide as he dove for better cover. "Are you hurt?" James called to Eleanor. "No, but I'm running low on ammunition." "Stay down. Ben's men have the others on the run, but these two are cornered, which makes them dangerous." James moved into the barn with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to fight in dangerous country. Eleanor watched him work, saw the careful way he cleared each potential hiding spot, the economy of movement that spoke of hard-won experience. "You in there," James called to the rustlers. "Your friends have run off and left you. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." "Go to hell," the leader snarled back. "We're not going to hang for some rancher's cattle." "Nobody's talking about hanging," James replied reasonably. "But if you keep shooting at my wife, I might change my mind about that." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at the protective steel in her husband's voice. This was the man who'd stood up to the town meeting, who'd defended her against Charles Manning's assumptions, who was now prepared to fight to keep their family safe. Collins, still clutching his wounded shoulder, raised his voice. "Martinez, maybe we should." "Shut up," Martinez hissed. "I'm thinking." Eleanor could hear the calculation in the rustler leader's voice, the desperate man's attempt to find some advantage in an increasingly hopeless situation. She caught James's eye and gestured toward the ladder that led to the hayloft, indicating that she could get a better angle from above. James shook his head firmly, but Eleanor was already moving. She'd learned that sometimes the most effective action was the unexpected one, and these men wouldn't expect a mere woman to take the offensive. She climbed the ladder as quietly as possible, grateful for the noise of the ongoing battle outside that masked the sound of her movement. From the loft, she could see both rustlers clearly, Martinez crouched behind a overturned wagon, Collins slumped against a support post, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side. Eleanor had a clear shot at Martinez, but taking it would mean killing a man, something she'd never done and wasn't sure she could do. But as she hesitated, she heard Collins whisper urgently to his partner. "There's a back way out through the tack room, if we can make it to the horses." "What about the woman?" Martinez asked. "Leave her for the boss to deal with later. He knows where she lives." The casual cruelty of the comment, the implication that they would return to threaten her family again, crystallized Eleanor's resolve. She thought of Sarah and Tommy hiding in the root cellar, of the life she and James were building together, of the community that had finally accepted her as one of their own. "Mr. Martinez," Eleanor called down from the loft, her voice carrying clearly through the barn. "I can see you both from here, and I want you to understand something." Martinez spun, trying to locate her position, his rifle swinging wildly. "I didn't come west to hide from men like you," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I came here to build a life worth fighting for, and that's exactly what I intend to do." Martinez's shot splintered the loft railing inches from Eleanor's position, but her return fire was more accurate. The rustler leader dropped his rifle and doubled over, clutching his side. James moved immediately, covering the distance to the wounded men with quick, efficient steps. "It's over," he said simply, kicking their weapons away. "Collins, get something to bind that shoulder. Martinez, sit down before you bleed out." Eleanor climbed down from the loft, her legs shaking slightly from reaction now that the immediate danger had passed. James was beside her in an instant, his arms wrapping around her as if to convince himself that she was real and unharmed. "You promised you'd stay hidden," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only relief and admiration. "I promised I'd protect the children," Eleanor corrected, "and I did, but I couldn't protect them from men who intended to come back and finish what they started." James held her tighter. "Eleanor, what you just did, most men wouldn't have had the courage." "Most men haven't had their children threatened by armed criminals," Eleanor interrupted. "James, I may have been a sheltered spinster when I came here, but I'm not that woman anymore. I'm a rancher's wife, a mother, a member of this community, and I'll fight for what's mine." Through the barn doors, they could see the aftermath of the battle. The neighbors had succeeded in driving off the main body of rustlers, though several cattle had been lost in the chaos. Dr. Fletcher was tending to a wounded ranch hand, while Ben Walsh and the other men were securing the perimeter. "The children," Eleanor said suddenly, remembering Sarah and Tommy hidden in the root cellar. "I'll get them," James said. "You've done enough fighting for one day." But Eleanor shook her head. "We'll get them together, as a family." They walked hand in hand toward the root cellar, stepping over scattered equipment and debris from the battle. Eleanor could hear Tommy crying inside the earthen structure, muffled but heartbreaking. James lifted the heavy wooden door, and Eleanor knelt down to the children's level. "It's all right," she called into the darkness. "It's over. You can come out now." Sarah emerged first, blinking in the sudden sunlight, followed by Tommy, who launched himself into Eleanor's arms with the force of a cannonball. Eleanor held him close, feeling his small body shake with relieved sobs. "I was scared, Ma," he whispered against her shoulder. "I thought the bad men might hurt you and Papa." "The bad men are gone," Eleanor said firmly, "and we're all safe." Sarah, ever the older sister, was looking around at the signs of battle with sharp, observant eyes. "Did you really fight them, Ma?" Mrs. Fletcher said ladies don't fight. Eleanor exchanged a glance with James, seeing the pride and love in his expression. "Sometimes, sweetheart, ladies have to fight. When the people we love are in danger, we do whatever it takes to protect them." "Even if we're scared?" Sarah asked. "Especially if we're scared," Eleanor replied. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not frightened. It means you do what's right even when you are frightened." Ben Walsh approached them, his hat in his hands and his expression sheepish. "Mrs. Cutter, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." Eleanor looked at him curiously. "What do you mean, Mr. Walsh?" "I mean I was wrong about you, about this marriage, about whether you belonged here." Ben's weathered face was flushed with embarrassment. "Watching you fight for your family today, well, it's clear you're exactly where you belong." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Thank you, Ben. That means more to me than you know." Dr. Fletcher joined them, his medical bag in hand and his expression concerned. "Anyone injured? Mrs. Cutter, you look like you've been through quite an ordeal." "I'm fine, Doctor. Just a few scrapes and bruises." Eleanor looked around at the gathered neighbors, men who had risked their own safety to help defend her family's ranch. "Thank you all. We couldn't have driven them off without your help." "That's what neighbors do," Dr. Fletcher said simply. "We look out for each other." As the sun began to set over the ranch, casting long shadows across the land they'd fought to defend, Eleanor stood with her arm around James's waist, watching their neighbors prepare to return to their own homes and families. The children were safe, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and she had proven to herself as much as to anyone else that she belonged here. The family Bible she'd clutched during the fight was still in her hand, its familiar weight, a reminder of the generations of strong women who had built lives in difficult places. Now she was part of that legacy, part of the continuing story of courage and determination that defined the American frontier. "Are you sure you're all right?" James asked quietly, his eyes searching her face for signs of delayed shock or reaction. Eleanor smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her despite the day's violence. "I'm better than all right, James. I'm home." 6 months later, Eleanor stood at the garden gate she'd built with her own hands, watching the morning sun paint the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and amber. The wooden gate was simple but sturdy, fashioned from lumber James had brought from town and fitted with hinges she'd insisted on installing herself. It marked the boundary between the wild country and the cultivated space she'd created. But more than that, it represented something permanent, something that belonged to her in a way nothing ever had before. The garden itself was thriving beyond her wildest expectations. Neat rows of vegetables stretched toward the horizon, beans and squash, corn and tomatoes, herbs that perfumed the morning air with their rich scents. She'd learned to work this soil, to understand its moods and seasons, to coax abundance from earth that had seemed impossibly harsh when she'd first arrived. Behind her, the sounds of the ranch awakening drifted from the house and outbuildings. James's voice as he spoke to the horses, Tommy's laughter as he chased the barn cats, Sarah's more measured tones as she helped with the morning chores. These were the sounds of home, as familiar now as her own heartbeat. The attack by the rustlers had marked a turning point, not just for their family but for the entire community. The men who'd been captured had provided information that led to the arrest of a larger organization operating throughout the territory. More importantly, the way Eleanor had fought to defend her home had earned her a respect that went far beyond grudging acceptance. The quilting circle had grown to include women from ranches as far as 20 miles away, all of them drawn by Eleanor's combination of practical skill and genuine warmth. What had started as a way to combat isolation had become the foundation of a support network that strengthened the entire region. Martha Hendricks still disapproved, of course, but her influence had waned considerably after several of the women she'd tried to recruit for her campaign against Eleanor had witnessed the aftermath of the rustler attack. It was difficult to argue that someone didn't belong in the community when they'd risked their life to defend it. "Ma," Sarah's voice interrupted Eleanor's peaceful contemplation. "The Fletchers are here for the anniversary celebration." Eleanor turned to see her stepdaughter approaching, no longer the wary 12-year-old who'd watched her with careful distrust, but a confident young woman who'd learned to trust in the permanence of love. The transformation in Sarah had been one of Eleanor's greatest joys, watching the girl blossom as she realized that this new mother wasn't going to disappear like the first one had. "Tell them I'll be right there," Eleanor said, but she made no immediate move to leave the garden. Today marked exactly 1 year since she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Sage Creek, 1 year since she'd married James and begun the most challenging and rewarding chapter of her life. The woman who'd arrived that day, desperate, uncertain, convinced of her own inadequacy, seemed like a stranger now. Eleanor had discovered reserves of strength she'd never suspected, had learned skills she'd never imagined needing, had found happiness in places she'd never thought to look. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn again. James was walking toward her, his movements carrying the easy confidence of a man at peace with his world. At 43, he looked younger than he had when she'd first met him, the lines of worry and loneliness smoothed away by contentment and purpose. "Admiring your handiwork?" he asked, gesturing toward the flourishing garden. "Thinking about how much has changed," Eleanor replied, leaning into his embrace as naturally as breathing. "A year ago, I thought I was coming here to escape failure. Now I realize I was coming here to find success." James kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Any regrets?" It was a question he'd asked before, though not for months now. Eleanor understood his need for reassurance, his lingering worry that she might someday long for the life Charles Manning had offered her. "Only one," she said, and felt James tense slightly. "I regret that it took me 38 years to find you." James's answering smile was brilliant enough to rival the morning sun. "Well, when you put it that way." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the ranch come to life around them. In the distance, Eleanor could see the new calves James had been so proud of, their coats gleaming in the sunlight as they frolicked in the pasture. The herd had grown substantially over the past year, partly due to James's careful breeding program and partly due to the increased security that had followed the rustler arrests. "Ready to face the celebration?" James asked. I think half the territory is planning to attend. Eleanor laughed. Good. It's time this community had something to celebrate that doesn't involve criticizing someone's choices. The anniversary party had been Dr. Fletcher's idea, supported enthusiastically by the other neighbors who'd come to recognize what James and Eleanor had built together. It was partly a celebration of their marriage, but also an acknowledgement of how their union had strengthened the entire community. As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor caught sight of the quilting frame through the front window. The star pattern she and the other women had worked on was finally complete. Its intricate design, a testament to the power of many hands working toward a common goal. Tonight, they would present it to the church as a donation, but Eleanor knew it represented something more valuable than its practical use. It represented the bonds of friendship and mutual support that had grown from her simple desire to bring women together. The house was already full of neighbors and friends, their voices creating a warm buzz of conversation and laughter. Mrs. Fletcher was arranging wildflowers in mason jars, while Margaret Walsh directed the placement of food on the long tables James had set up in the front yard. Even some of the younger couples had come, bringing their children to play with Sarah and Tommy. Eleanor moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, marveling at how natural it felt to be the hostess of such a gathering. The shy, uncertain woman who'd arrived a year ago would never have believed she could command such respect and affection from a roomful of frontier families. "Mrs. Cutter," a familiar voice called out, and Eleanor turned to see Ben Walsh approaching with his wife Margaret. "Could we have a word?" Eleanor nodded, following them to a quieter corner of the porch. Ben's expression was serious, almost formal, and Eleanor felt a flutter of concern. "Margaret and I have been talking," Ben began, "about what happened last year, about the things I said, the way I acted when you first arrived." "Ben, that's all in the past," Eleanor said gently. "There's no need to—" "Yes, there is," Ben interrupted. "I was wrong, Eleanor. Not just wrong about you, but wrong about what makes a good marriage, a strong family, a healthy community. You've proven that in ways I'm still trying to understand." Margaret stepped forward, her usually reserved expression warm with genuine feeling. "What Ben's trying to say is that you've made us all better neighbors, better people. The way you've brought the women together, the way you've cared for anyone who needed help. You've reminded us what community really means." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I was just trying to find my place here." "You didn't find your place," Margaret said firmly. "You created it, and in doing so, you created places for all of us to be better than we were." The simple sincerity of the words struck Eleanor with unexpected force. She'd come here seeking acceptance, but she'd ended up building something much more valuable, a community, where people supported each other, not out of obligation but out of genuine care and respect. "Thank you," Eleanor managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Both of you. That means more to me than you can know." The afternoon passed in a blur of food and conversation, laughter and shared stories. Eleanor found herself at the center of it all, no longer the outsider looking in, but the heart around which the celebration revolved. Children ran between the tables, their voices bright with excitement, while the adults shared news and gossip, plans and hopes for the future. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, James called for everyone's attention. The crowd gathered around him, their faces expectant in the golden light. "A year ago," James began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled group, "I made what some folks thought was a foolish decision. I married a woman I'd never met, based on nothing more than letters and hope." There were chuckles from the crowd, but also nods of understanding and approval. "What I didn't know then," James continued, "was that I wasn't just gaining a wife. I was gaining a partner who would make me a better man, a mother who would help heal my children's hearts, and a neighbor who would strengthen our entire community." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as James turned to face her directly. "Eleanor, you came here looking for a home, but you brought home with you. You brought the kind of love that doesn't just fill a house, but overflows into everything around it." James's voice grew thick with emotion. I love you for who you were when you arrived, but I love you even more for who you've become, for who you've helped all of us become." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Eleanor barely heard it. She was looking into James's eyes, seeing in them the same wonder and gratitude she felt in her own heart. Later, after the last guests had departed and the children had been tucked into bed, Eleanor and James sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The house behind them was quiet now, but it hummed with the contentment of a family secure in its happiness. "Do you remember what I told you that first day?" James asked, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "About this ranch not being the biggest spread in the territory, but being ours." Eleanor nodded, remembering the shy pride in his voice, the way he'd looked at his modest holdings with such satisfaction. "I was wrong," James said quietly. "It's not just ours anymore. It's home to everyone who's found shelter here, everyone who's been welcomed at our table, everyone who's been strengthened by what we've built together." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people," she said softly, "something I could watch from the outside but never really experience myself. And now," Eleanor smiled, thinking of the garden she'd planted, the children who called her mother, the community of women who gathered around her quilting frame, the man who loved her, not despite her age and plainness, but because of the strength and grace those very qualities had given her. "Now, I know that happiness isn't something that happens to you," she said. "It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, with people who matter to you." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss, hope and disappointment, dreams realized and dreams deferred. But tonight, they looked down on a small ranch in New Mexico territory, where a woman who'd thought herself too old for love had found not just a husband, but a family, not just a home, but a community, not just acceptance, but the kind of deep, abiding happiness that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. Eleanor Hart Cutter had finally found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she'd never expected to look for it, in the arms of a weathered cowboy, in the hearts of two children who'd needed a mother, in the respect of neighbors who'd learned to value her for who she truly was. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come, of challenges yet to be faced, of joys yet to be discovered. But whatever the future held, Eleanor knew she would meet it with the confidence of a woman who had learned her own worth, had claimed her own happiness, and had proven that love truly has no expiration date. As James led her inside their home, their real, permanent, chosen home, Eleanor cast one last glance at the garden gate, standing open in the moonlight, welcoming whatever blessings tomorrow might bring.